It's lesson 6, part 2. If you watched the first, you may be wondering, our first video is from the morning class, but we largely did the same things. We were setting up the ability to delete. So even though it was a different application, the code that we did in the first video, lesson 6, part 1, pretty much identical to what we did in our afternoon class. And the code is on GitHub. So we've created our delete links. We've invoked our JavaScript confirmation. So now we want to write the code to validate the primary key value and then connect to the database, delete it, show the user a message. So we'll open up on our delete page, we'll open up a block of PHP tags. So we will get PK from the URL param, validate it. We will connect, set up and run SQL delete. We'll disconnect, show confirmation. So we have two checks that we want with our URL parameter. We want to make sure it exists, and we want to make sure it's numeric. Okay, if either one of those things isn't true, we want to show an error message. So first we'll say we can use isSet, built-in function in PHP. It's like the opposite of empty, basically. Very slight technical difference, but we're going to use the get array with the parameter of artist ID, and it is case sensitive. So if it is set and if it's numeric. So we want to check both of these things. And we can have else statements if either one of them is false. So if it is not set, so if the variable is not declared and it's not null, we can just print out a message saying, we'll print it as an alert. Warning. Artist missing. I'll copy that same statement in here. So if we have no artist ID, we're going to print out a message in yellow saying the artist is missing. Or if we have an artist ID, but it is not a number, again, we're going to print out an error message here. So how does this work? So if I remove my artist ID entirely, I get this yellow warning, or I set it to a value that is not a number. Again, it's going to say artist missing. Only if I have a numeric value, then there's no warning. So all of our code, all of these steps should actually happen inside of this if condition. Because this means, okay, we've got an artist ID. I'm going to actually move this stuff up here. We only need to connect and do these other things in the event that we have a valid numeric ID. Our connection's really simple, right? We just require our database file. We're going to use delete from. One of the common errors in new programmers is they try to type delete star. We only use star for select queries. It is not used in SQL when we are deleting. We're going to delete from artists where so we will set up a parameter. We don't want to delete all the artists, only the one the user clicked on. We'll set up a new command, object, just like we've done on all the other pages where we perform some kind of create, read, update, or delete. And now we need to populate the artist ID parameter from our URL parameter. If the URL artist ID is 5005, we need to pass that value in. So we can call bind param. So we're going to pass in our get variable as an integer. And of course, we want to actually execute this delete command so that the operation runs in our MySQL server and that record is removed from the table. I could also put this in a variable. We're not really using it again, so I've skipped that step. Wouldn't be a bad idea to first store this in a local variable and use it. We'll disconnect. We'll show a message. It says artist has been deleted. We can put in a link. And we'll give them a link to go back to the artist list page. And I need my semicolon. So we should be able to try this out now. Connect to our database, set up our delete instruction with our primary key as a parameter in the where clause. We prepare our statement, populate our parameter, run the delete, disconnect, and show the user a message. I think it looks pretty good, but the only way to know for sure is to try it out. So just going to move this a little bit. So I'm going to go back. I've got a bunch of artists here where I've got some blanks. So I want to delete. I say OK. I get a blue message saying it's been deleted. And now when I return, it's gone. I want to delete some of my other ones that are blank. This artist's been deleted. So our delete seems to be working. We get our confirmation, and it is deleting the proper ID, which is what we want. Now, somebody asked a good question this morning. They said, what if the artist ID exists and it is a number, but that ID doesn't exist in the database. So something like this. Go to delete, artist, HP, artist. So I put in something like this. So I know this ID number doesn't exist in the database. In this case, I would say this is okay. We don't really care. So we've tried to delete a record, that record doesn't exist. So no changes are made to the database. Technically, I guess this message isn't totally accurate, but it's fine, really. If someone wants to delete something that doesn't exist, it doesn't throw an error. So I would suggest it's okay if the artist ID doesn't exist. It doesn't break anything, no harm is done. Okay, so here's our completed code for doing a delete. Don't forget your where clause. If you don't have a where clause, your delete will, okay, Gabriel, I'm glad you posted that, because there were students who got that this morning, and we'll get that error every time. Anybody have an idea, what does the error that Gabriel posted mean? Invalid parameter number of bound variables does not match number of tokens. It's a really common error, and it has a very specific cause and effect. So which line numbers do we need to look at in order to fix the error Gabriel's posted? Invalid parameter number of bound variables does not match number of tokens. Right, okay. So Hussein is saying it's line 25 and line 23. So in the SQL statement, there is one parameter, and we can see the parameter with a colon. We have one bind param statement, which is as it should be. So Gabriel, there's one of two possibilities here. Number one, you're maybe missing the colon or the bind param statement. However many parameters are in the SQL, and the parameters have this colon as a prefix, you should have the same number of bind param statements. The other thing is you have to match the name exactly. So I wrote the parameter, I declared it as in camel case here. It also has to be in camel case there. So Gabriel, check line 23 and 25 very carefully with what's on my screen for any discrepancy. Dominic, you mean, can you do, there you go. Right? Yep, I will always use camel case in this course. I will never use, Tyler, the way you've got capital I, capital D. You'll never see me use that. Being consistent about how you name things is really important to prevent these kinds of errors. Dominic, is it possible? It is possible to do the delete directly from the artist page, but it's complicated. You would have to use JavaScript to invoke an HTTP or jQuery to invoke an HTTP GET request. So technically, can you do it? Yes. I find just building a separate delete page is a little cleaner. The other thing you could do to make it look a little more seamless is this message on the delete page, it's not really necessary. The other thing you could do is we could just redirect the user back automatically after the delete runs. We could use a PHP function to just take them back directly. I don't, in a real world application, that's probably better. But here, the reason I don't want to add a redirect is if we put in a redirect and you get an error, we don't see the error message. So when we're learning, those redirects make debugging much more difficult. So I don't recommend adding redirects at this stage. I would do it later. Well, no, Dominic, you would still need to use PHP. You would need a PHP page or method, but it would be invoked using jQuery. jQuery can't connect and access the database. jQuery is client side only. But you could get jQuery, instead of loading the delete page, you would make like a hidden HTTP request using jQuery. But that also makes it more difficult to debug, because if that request throws an error, the error is going to be like in the jQuery console, but you're not going to see it. So again, when we're learning, I would recommend that process is overly complex and difficult to debug. So technically, can you do it? Yes. I wouldn't recommend it at this point. No. Okay, so delete is done. So we're 3/4 of the way there to building our full-scale CRUD application, right? We can add, we can read, and we can delete. Now we need to do the updating. The updating is the most involved. So here's how update's going to work. We want to turn the artist names into links. When I click on any artist name, we want to link to the artist details. I want the artist name to pre-fill, and I want the genre to also be populated. And then when I save, instead of inserting a new artist, we want to update the existing artist. So I can add an artist here to be updated. I'll say they are, jazz musician. So I can insert, but now I want to be able to click this and change it. Save those changes to the database without adding a new record in again. So step one on our artist page is we want to turn the names into links. You could also we could add edit buttons here as an option, but then we have to allow more space. So on our artists page, first column, we've got the artist name. We're going to wrap the name in an anchor tag. We're going to open an anchor tag here and close it over on this side. So inside our first column, we are going to link to artist details.php. And again, like on our delete links, we are going to append on okay, so that's getting sort of messy. Our artist name. I'm going to move my closing tag in here. Okay, so we don't need a click handler. We should never add a confirmation onto an edit link, only a delete link. So this is what the value in our first column looks like now. I've put it in the chat. So we're going to display the artist name, and each artist name is a link to the artist details page. That link takes a parameter of the primary key field. So we were wrapping the artist name in table cells. We're also now wrapping it in an anchor tag inside of the table cells. So that should make each artist name into a link. So if we reload here, we've now got links. If you want, you could even change the color of these links. Maybe I won't do that right now. So I click, it takes me to my artist details page, passes in the primary key. So now we're going to need some logic on our artist details page to check for a numeric primary key. And if there is one, we want to fetch the artist name and the genre from the database so we can display those values in our form. It's when we're adding an artist, our form should be blank. But when we're editing, the form should display all of the existing values. So for this artist, the name should say to be updated, and the genre should default to jazz. So we're going to need to make a bunch of changes now to our details page. We're going to need some logic at the top, some PHP code, a database query. We're also going to need to modify some of the HTML in the form. So if we have an artist that we query from the database, we can populate the individual values into the corresponding form controls. So let's go to our artist details. I'm going to put all this code in between the head and the body because I want it to go above the form tag. Okay. So we will check for artist ID, URL param. We have one. Query DB and populate form. Not show blank form. So we're repurposing this page so it might be blank if the user wants to add a new artist. It will be populated if they're editing an existing artist. I think what I'll do is first, we're going to need a few variables. I'm going to initialize all of them to null. So our artist table, it's got 3 columns, artist ID, name, and genre ID. So I'm going to initialize variables in camel case. They match the field names in our table. I'm going to initialize all of them to null. And now we can check if our get artist ID is set and that value is numeric, then we'll populate our artist ID and query the database. And I think I've got a bracket problem around bracket. And now we will set up and execute a query to fetch this artist record. And we're going to use the same parameter. Right, Gabriel? Same parameter we used from our delete. We're selecting from artists, but we only need one record. Our next 2 lines of code, they're again just a duplicate. We create the command and we bind the parameter. And then we execute. I guess the next 3 lines are really the exact duplicate from artist, delete artist. Create a command, bind the parameter, and execute. So fairly repetitive. So our parameter name is :artist ID. We're going to pass in our artist ID variable. Set it up as an integer. And again, we just call execute to run the query. So this stuff should be starting to get pretty familiar. We've been doing it over and over again. You did it in your lab, you did it in your assignment. Now this one thing is going to be, the next line is going to be a little bit different from what we've done before. We actually have another query, database query on this page already, where we are selecting the genres to fill our drop-down list. Let's just scroll down and have a quick look at that. So here we've got a different SQL select, we prepare, we execute, and then we call fetch all, which returns an array of row sets. So we use fetch all when our query might return multiple records. In this case, we are only looking up, we're going to get one record or no records back because we're querying based on the primary key filter. We don't need to use fetch all because fetch all expects an array, so it uses a little more server memory. Instead of calling fetch all, I'm just going to call the fetch method. If this returns a single row. So it's actually a little more efficient in terms of performance and memory. Fetch all for single row queries. And when we use fetch, this means we don't need a loop. Right? If we use fetch all, it would work, but we would still have to create a for each loop and go through one time. When we call fetch, this just automatically populates one record. So it's a little more efficient. And then we can populate our local variables of the artist name and the genre of this artist. And lastly, we'll disconnect. So we're only going to do this stuff when we have a numeric value passed in as URL parameter called artist ID. If there is no numeric artist ID, all of this code is just ignored. Our variable has to be set and it has to be a number. If it's not set or it's not numeric, we ignore this stuff. Now I'm going to try clicking on one of my artist names again. It should bring me to this page. We won't see anything yet. My form is still going to be blank. I just want to try it and make sure this code doesn't throw an error. So to check, I can just go back, click on any artist. As long as I'm not seeing an error message, my form's still loading, then that's good. That's encouraging. Now you may wonder, why did we initialize these to null? Good question. I will show you. I'm going to comment out this little block of code here for a moment. Because we don't really need these variables yet, but I'll show you why in a minute. I'm just going to comment those out. So now that we've fetched the artist name and the genre, we can display them in our form. We'll start with the artist name first. So when we have an artist name, I want to inject it down here on line 41. I want to print the existing name into the name input. So I can use the value attribute and some messy syntax. Inside the value, we can open a set of PHP tags and echo out our name variable. Okay, so I'm adding this attribute here into my name box. So I go back and refresh now. The artist name should be appearing in that text box. Fresh. And now, whatever the name is that matches this ID, it gets printed to name. Right? Springsteen, to be updated. So the name is here. So that seems to be working. We'll have to deal with our drop-down. It's a little more complicated in a minute. But I wanted to show you why I declared those three variables and initialized them to null. So this seems to work to print the name. The query's working. The problem is this. If I go to add a new artist, now I get this here. Warning. Hard to read in the text box, but if we view the page source, now it says name is undefined. So it works fine when we're editing and we're populating the name variable, but when I go to add, if I don't initialize this variable to null, my form shows this error here. By declaring and initializing our variables up here, that avoids those variable undefined errors when we are adding a new artist. So now if I refresh, that error message is no longer. Okay, so it's useful to initialize those variables as null. So this way our form looks correct, regardless of if we're adding or we're editing. It doesn't matter. But you'll get those same errors without initializing those variables. So our artist name is printing. The drop-down list is a bit more complicated. It doesn't have a value property of the whole control, so we can't just use this. This isn't going to do anything on our HTML select. So what we need to do is we need to add a little bit of logic inside of this loop. As we are looping through the results of the genre query, we want to compare the current genre ID to the genre ID variable, the genre ID property of our artist. And when they are the same, we want to select that option. So we'll just add a little if statement in our for each. Here's what it will look like. We'll say if and else. And I'm going to move the existing echo command where we print the options. I'm going to move that into the else statement. And here's what our if statement is going to be. If genre ID, and you must use a double equals here. We are comparing. If the current genre is equal to the genre ID of the artist, then we're going to do something similar to this, but we're going to add something. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in, which I know seems silly right now. You go, these look identical. But we're going to add in here, when they are equal, we're going to add a selected attribute. So when we are looping through and printing out the genres, when the genre matches the artist genre, we're going to add this selected attribute to that option. So this should then, when we're editing an artist, it should select the correct genre in the dropdown by default. Try it out and see. So it says Springsteen is rock. I'll all-time low is alternative. So my drop-down is still populated, but it pre-selects the correct option. Save as get. So our form is now being populated correctly. The name shows in the name box. The genre shows. The genre selection is correct. And if we have no artist, we just get a blank form. So this looks complete, looks correct. There's actually one more thing we need here. There's something else we have to put into our form. It doesn't have to be visible, but it's got to be in our form in order that we can save changes. So if I go here, what else do we need in our form? I've got a name, I've got a genre. When I hit save, I want to post the form, and I want the database, I want artist ID 5010 to be updated. Okay, yeah, Mike, you're on the right track. What will tell us? So how are we going to know on the next page which update? Yeah, we're going to need to include this ID, right? We have the ID in the URL here, but the web is stateless, right? So this variable, this URL parameter, it will get removed. When I hit save and post the form, we will lose this ID. So I want to embed the artist ID value in my form. It doesn't have to be visible to the user, but the value has to be included somewhere between the opening and closing form tag, because we're going to need the primary key on the next page. So in my form down at the bottom, but before I close the form, I'm going to add an input with type of hidden, type being hidden. My name will be artist ID. My ID will be artist ID. And we're going to print the value. So the user isn't going to see this field, but we need it in our form. Otherwise, our update is never going to run. It's not going to make any changes in the database. We need to know, we need that primary key embedded in the form. You won't see it here. I refresh my browser because I've got type is hidden. But if I view the source, right, now you can see that my ID value is included in the form. So when I post the form, we'll have access to that identifier. We'll know which artist we want the users trying to edit. So whenever we have a form where we're editing, we're going to need to include that primary key value. We don't typically show it to the end users, but it needs to be there. Just like with our dropdown, right? The users don't see the genre IDs. They only see the names, but we are still using the values of the genre IDs. So our details form is done. We're going to need to add about, say, about 10 lines to our save page, so that if I make changes here and save them, those will get committed to the database. Okay, anybody need to see anything else on the details page before we move over to the save page? Or are there questions about the additions we've made here? Seems a bit confusing. That's okay. This is the most complicated of the 4 CRUD operations. It's the most amount of work. Create, read, and delete are all simpler. Okay. So something must be getting missed, probably up here. Or else there may just be an issue with the value statement and the selected option. I will upload to GitHub short. So we're going to need to add some logic to our save artist page. Because right now, all it does is insert a new artist. So if I go ahead and change something here, I change artist ID 5010 from to be updated. I change the name. Oh, I guess I've already got. Save. Even though I had an ID, my artist 5010 is still here, and it still says to be updated, and it added this artist as 5011. So our save page, right now it's hard-coded, it will always insert. So we're going to make some additions here. So this page could insert and also update. So first, let's create a variable to read our hidden field. When we're inserting, whoops, this should be artist ID. When we're inserting, this will be null because the ID doesn't get created until after the insert runs in MySQL. But when we're updating, we will have the primary key embedded in our form. So this is why we use that hidden field. So now we know which artist we want to update. So we'll add that variable up at the top. And we're going to wrap this in an if statement. So we'll say, if empty, if our artist ID is empty, then we're going to run an insert. Otherwise, we need a different SQL command. We need an update statement. As you probably learned in your database class, the structure of an update statement is pretty different. In an insert, you have a list of all the columns and then a list of all the values. In update, we pair them. One field, one value, one field, one value. So in this case, we're going to set a name to our name parameter. We'll set the genre ID to the genre ID parameter. And then we need our where clause. So here's a pro tip for you. When writing update statements, never forget your where clause. I did this once. I have never forgotten it. I told this story in my morning class. I used to have a customer, they had like an online educational bookstore. They had about 600 plus books. And one Friday afternoon, I was getting ready to leave, go up to my in-laws' cottage. It was a beautiful summer. About 5 o'clock, they sent me an email and they said, Rich, we want to put this book on sale. I think it was regularly priced $29.99. And they said, we're taking $10 off. Can you update it, change the price to $19.99? And there was no admin page for them to do it at the time. I hadn't built it. So I was in a hurry, trying to get my little kids in the car. I opened up my SQL editor and I typed update books, set price equal to $19.99, and I executed the query. Oh, yes. So I changed the price for all 600 plus books from whatever those prices were. I made every single one of them, put them all on sale for $19.99. Needless to say, I didn't get to the cottage on time that day. I had to go pay my hosting company $75 US to restore a backup of the table. It took hours. It was a big headache. So make sure you have a where clause when you are updating or deleting. Now we need one more thing on this page, and then it's done. We'll actually be done shortly. So we're checking for an artist ID. If we don't have one, we are inserting. If we do have one, it's not empty. We're going to update. So what else is missing here? If I try to run an update right now, I'm going to get an error. Not so much the validation. Why will I get an error? So if I go to save an update right now, let me go back here. I try to update this again. Save my code. So I'll put in a 1, change jazz to rock. What error is going to happen? Gabriel, it's your favorite error. Why is this going to throw an error now? Alex, not exactly. Right. Same error we saw earlier, invalid parameter number. How many parameters are there in our update statement? Right. 3 parameters, name, genre ID, and artist. How many parameters are we populating with bind param statements? 2. You got it. So we need another if statement. We need to say if we have an artist ID, we also need to bind that parameter, but only when we have an artist ID, right? When we're inserting, we don't want to bind that parameter. So we'll say, so we will bind artist ID param only when we have one. So we'll say if is set, right? If we have an artist ID, because we're updating, guess what? We also need to bind it. And Akeem, thanks. I know you mentioned this, right? We need that bind param. So we may have on this page we have 2 different SQL commands that could run. One is 2 parameters, and one is 3 parameters. So depending on which statement we're running, we may or may not need that 3rd parameter. When we're inserting, we only need these 2. We don't have an artist ID yet. But when we're updating, we need that. Whoops, and this should be bind param, not bind column. I guess we could. It won't do anything if it's not. You're saying, so it wouldn't hurt to check, but if it's not, nothing's going to get updated. No problem, Alex. I've never even used bind column, so I don't even know what it does, to be honest with you. And now if I refresh, it says saved. And now I see a 1, and it says rock. Again, I want to change this. So now I should be able to update. So now we can save. And I will make sure I haven't broken the insert, that I can still also insert. Okay, so good thing I checked. Why did we get? Okay, so my check isn't quite right. Good thing I tried. Maybe I will try it this way. Let's see. I'll say if not empty. Maybe is set isn't the right method to use. I'll say if it's not empty. Try that. That should fix my problem. Think. Oh. Okay. Yes. So using is set was a bad idea. So when it is not empty, bind the parameter. So now we can add and edit and delete. Okay, so these are the fundamentals of basically any web application building. We could pretty much add any type of functionality we wanted in here now with the code we've already written over 6 classes. So what I will do, I'm going to push this up to GitHub. And then I will give you your lab and I will set you free. And if you have questions, I can stick around and help for anybody who needs help. So update is complete. Okay, so all the code we've done is on GitHub. You do have a lab as well. Again, you have 20 days. The lab is just due before the midterm. So I will show you the lab. The MySQL commands are actually on, no, they're not on GitHub, but they are on D2L in the lesson, I think, 2 and 3 folder. So for lab 3, here's what you need to do. So you don't have to do insert for lab 3, but you do need to do read, update, and delete. You're going to run this script in your AWS database. It's going to create a table and populate 7 English Premiership football clubs. You'll build a page that shows all of these teams and their stadiums or their grounds in an HTML table. There will be an edit link and a delete link. The delete link should have a JavaScript confirmation. When they click edit, you're going to load a form that populates the team name and ground name. And then we should be able to save changes, which will update that record in the database. Okay, and you can just put on a message. You don't have to do a redirect, just a link back. You'll create a private repository called Comp1006 Lab 3. Push your files, add me as a collaborator, and add a README file. Also upload your files to the AWS server, and again, include both your GitHub link and AWS link on GitHub. Okay, so this is good practice for the midterm. Practice reading data, updating, deleting data. I may ask you to do similar things on the midterm. Okay, I know it's a little bit repetitive in terms of assignments, but that is by design. We want you to keep practicing so that you get good at it.